Welcome back to the Curdverse. I'm Lisa Kaywood, corporate functionary by day, home cheesemaker by night. This episode is a bonus replay of last year's Cheeses of the Season Fall and Winter edition. As we head into the year-end holiday season in the Northern Hemisphere, we'll be covering two topics for the price of one episode: winter cheeses and holiday cheese boards. Enjoy. First, let's talk about the nature of milk in the winter months and what that means for cheese made at this time of year. In other Cheeses of the Seasons episodes, I've talked about the basic pattern of seasonal shifts in milk composition. It's typically lower in fat and a bit on the watery side in the spring, with fat and protein content rising relative to the milk fluids over the summer. By this time of year, late fall, overall volume of output is low, and in fact, sheep and goats are often more or less dried off by this time, producing no milk at all. But what milk is available is extremely rich and dense. The taste of the milk shifts as well. In colder regions, spring and summer milk is characterized by the flavors of fresh young grass and sometimes wildflowers. By late fall, they've returned to lower elevations if they spent time in the mountains in the summer, and now they're on dry fodder. Cheeses made in late fall and winter can taste more of hay and toastier, earthier flavors compared to spring and summer cheeses. The high fat content of the milk makes for different sorts of cheeses. Fat retains a lot of moisture in the curd, so winter cheeses tend to be denser, softer in texture, and creamier in mouthfeel than even the exact same recipe made with spring or summer milk. Cheesemakers take advantage of these differences to make a number of soft, often gooey cheeses at this time. These tend to be lower in acid and melt really well, which is just the thing for when you want something rich and filling on a cold winter night. Vacherin Mondor, which I've mentioned a few times, is a classic of this time of year, along with its cousin Vacherin d'Abondance. In the U.S., Rush Creek Reserve and Winnemere are similar cheeses. But there are a number of harder cheeses that are made in large quantities in the summer and smaller quantities in the winter, such as raclette. Sometimes they're specifically labeled as summer or winter cheeses because the winter cheeses are milder and creamier in flavor. For those of us who live in Mediterranean climates where we basically only get precipitation in winter, things are partially reversed. We get the fresh grass flavors more in winter and early spring milk, and the hay notes during the dry summer months. In regions that tend to favor sheep and goats, farmers sometimes split their herds in two, breeding half their animals in the fall and half in the spring. Cows can be bred more or less year-round and give milk for around 10 months after calving. But sheep and goats are highly seasonal breeders, whose cycles apparently align with light levels associated with spring and fall. And they typically give milk for 6 to 8 months. So in order to have milk and cheese available for most of the year, farmers in regions that may be cooler in winter but aren't covered in snow and where the animals can still forage well in the winter months, it makes sense for them to split their herd. But their milk is still higher in fat in the wintertime, and I found this especially pronounced in sheep milk, which is a high-fat milk to begin with. The same recipe made with winter milk will yield as much as 1/3 more curd compared to spring or summer milk, but it's a much softer, milder cheese. All right, now let's talk about putting together a nice cheese spread for the holidays. You can definitely do better than cubes of rubbery Swiss and cheddar. In fact, the first thing to know is that unless you're catering a party of a few hundred guests, you don't want to pre-cut the cheese at all. It dries out, loses flavor, and in most cases, cutting cheese in chunks is less than an ideal way to taste it, because as we've discussed over the last several episodes, the rind is an integral part of the flavor of most cheeses. So the main thing to think about is variety. You want a variety of flavors and textures in a cheese plate, and I like to have a variety of different milk types as well. Classically, that means you'll start with a fresh or soft cheese like a chèvre or some other young goat, or a brie-type bloomy rind cheese, followed by a firmer aged cheese like a cheddar or a Gouda or some Alpine cheese, finishing with a washed rind or a blue. During the holidays, there are often a number of truffle-spiked cheeses in stores, and these can be great festive additions. You can have as many different kinds of cheeses as your tastes and budget will allow, really. For 10 to 15 people, I usually have 6 to 7 different kinds of cheese. We like cheese. Assume 2 to 3 quarter to half-inch slices for each cheese per person, if that helps you eyeball the minimum amount to get of each one. Of course, it's not terrible to have more than you need. Most cheeses will last for weeks after your holiday gathering, and then you just have more cheese in your life. That said, it's worth gauging the age of the cheese you buy, since it can be a problem in the US for soft cheeses and bloods. Let's take that in 3 parts. Fresh, spreadable cheeses like Chev should be an even white with no discoloration. If you see colors, especially yellow or pink, keep moving. So these cheeses are usually sold in shrink-wrapped packaging. Once you open them, they'll usually keep for around 7 to 10 days. So if you have leftovers, keep them wrapped up fairly close without air around them, like in a very small dish or Tupperware container with plastic wrap tucked around them directly against the surface. Slightly more solid ones can be wrapped in wax paper and then in plastic wrap. Soft, gooey bloomy rinds are sometimes sold too young, in which case they'll be oozy right along the rind but still cakey and hard in the middle. If you're getting a small wheel rather than a wedge where you can't see the interior at all, push on the middle with your finger. There should be a bit of give, and that give should be consistent from the middle to the edge of the cheese. But be aware, though, that there are a number of bloomy goat cheeses that are not supposed to get gooey and soft. So here again, you're looking for an even coat of mold, nothing wet looking, and a fairly fresh, clean smell. The more common problem with these bloomy cheeses is actually being too old. An over-aged cheese will have a lot of brown on the rind instead of an even snow-white coat of mold. And the interior, or the paste, often looks sort of gray. If you put your nose close to the cheese, you'll probably smell some ammonia even through the wrapper. Pass on those as well. And blues, because they're high moisture cheeses, also age fairly quickly. Sometimes the imported ones take too long to get to store shelves. The blue veins should be clean and well defined, not blurred into mushy white curds. And if the paste looks yellow-gray rather than an even ivory, or especially if you see any pink red lines, keep looking. Harder cheeses can last for weeks to months depending on how they're stored, so cheese age is less of a concern here. And if you do find unwanted mold on it, you can easily cut it off. The rest of the cheese will be just fine. Okay, so now you have a nice selection of cheeses. It's the day of your holiday gathering. Now what? The first thing you do is banish all thoughts of the overstuffed charcuterie boards you may have seen on Instagram. They're designed solely for looks and clicks, not for appreciating the flavor of the food. Start by arranging the wedges or wheels you've selected across your cutting board, maybe in a slight arc. As with wines, you arrange them from softest and mildest to hardest and strongest. And also like wine, you should give the cheeses time to come to room temperature to allow the flavors to fully open up. Usually this is about half an hour or so before you plan to serve them. If you're setting out your board as an appetizer before your main meal and leaving your guests to serve themselves, you can cut a few thin slices of each cheese, fewer than the number of guests you have, and arrange them next to their source wheel. The idea here is not to have everything pre-cut, but to invite your guests to dig in, since often people don't want to be the first person to cut into something that looks perfect and unopened. The other reason to do this is that many people are unsure how to cut cheese, and so by discreetly providing a few examples, you make it easier for your guests to follow suit. So when it comes to cutting, when I first arrived in France as an exchange student and was presented with a wedge of brie after dinner, I did what most Americans do. I cut off the tip, and I was promptly admonished. Because what you're supposed to do is cut along the side of the wedge, getting a very thin wedge for yourself, maybe a quarter inch or so that everyone else partaking of the cheese can do the same, everyone getting an equal amount of rind and paste. At the time, it was explained to me as politesse or politeness, but there are other strictly gustatory reasons for it too. Brie is one of many cheeses that ripen from the outside in. So if you cut off the tip, you get the least ripe part of the cheese, while everyone else after you gets progressively riper portions and more rind. The rind itself contributes flavor and texture, so ideally you want to experience it in a consistent ratio to the interior. Even outside of the bloomies, generally speaking, you won't go wrong if you cut a small quarter to half-inch wedge from the side of a larger one or out of a wheel, regardless of cheese type. That said, there's a fantastic video by the late Anne Saxelby about why you want to cut different kinds of cheeses one way versus another. It's a great way to relax and while away a free 20 minutes. So cheeses go great with fruit. So after arranging your cheeses, put out a variety of fruit on your cheese plate. Acidic ones like green apples are good for cutting the fat of the gooey ones. Pears, figs, drops of honey are nice with drier aged cheeses. Dried fruits and toasted nuts stand up well to blues. If you have a soft spreading cheese, you may want to provide some crackers or thin slices of bread to put it on. But if you've got nice tasty cheese, you really want to be able to fully taste the cheese, not have it covered up by a lot of bread. I've provided suggestions and links for most of the categories of cheese in other podcast episodes, so feel free to look at the show notes for ideas. I haven't talked about truffle cheeses before, so let me share a few of my favorites. There are a variety of truffled cheese spreads from major makers, but you can also make your own if you have truffle oil on hand, and it'll taste a lot fresher. Either buy or make fresh ricotta. I've got a couple of articles on how to make ricotta on intothecurdverse.com. Salt the ricotta a bit, put it in a sieve lined with muslin or a clean linen towel over a bowl, and let it drain in the fridge overnight. Once it's shed enough whey to be about the consistency of Chev, put it in a clean bowl, mix it with truffle oil to taste. You can use commercial Chev in the same way. And by the way, you can do other mix-ins instead of truffle oil if you like. Dried herbs, dried lemon peel, things like that. Several U.S. producers, as well as French ones, make truffled bries, including Cowgirl Creamery and Marin French Cheese Company. Trader Joe's sells an imported truffle brie during the holidays under their house brand, but that always seems to be very nice. They also have a very mild, semi-firm cheese from Italy all year round. And Cypress Grove has a bloomy rind truffled goat called Truffle Tremor that's also very nice. If you're a Gouda fan, I found a fantastic goat milk Gouda with truffles while in Amsterdam a few years ago. To my taste, the goat Gouda has a cleaner, brighter taste than many cow Goudas, and it sets off the truffles especially well. But you can find truffle Goudas of both varieties. I especially like truffles with sheep cheese. The umami of sheep cheese and the earthiness of the truffle pair really well. You can look for a truffled pecorino, for example. And there's a special type of pecorino called moliterno al tartufo from Italy, which has veins of truffle injected into the cheddar once it's about 6 months old. There's a Vermont producer who makes a Caerphilly-style cheddar in similar fashion, adding the truffles after cheddaring. Perhaps my favorite of all is sottocenere al tartufo, which literally means under ash with truffles. It's a mild, semi-soft cow milk cheese from the Veneto in Italy. The rind is made of finely ground vegetable ash mixed with truffles, cinnamon, nutmeg, coriander, and other spices. The rind has a slight crunch that contrasts nicely with a soft, creamy center. This episode marks the end of the second season of Into the Curdverse. I hope you've enjoyed this season and return again for the next one. Next season, we'll be covering a lot more esoteric topics, the specific qualities of different types of milk, the deep history of cheese across Afro-Eurasia, different types of cheeses that you may or may not find in your local supermarket from far-flung regions of the globe. In the meantime, I hope you'll take the opportunity to provide a review and or drop me an email. Let me know what you think of the podcast and topics you'd be interested in hearing more about. Enjoy your holiday cheeses, and join me again next season as we once again enter the Curdverse.